Hell in Dnipro. The occupiers are killing Ukrainians with ballistic missiles. And Solovyov is grinning and smiling at the same time.
Well, I used to dream of visiting the Dnipropetrovsk region. Back in Soviet times, I somehow never made it there, so I decided, well, now I'll go.
Caspian, Dagestan. Don't sleep. The so-called unparalleled Sarmat exploded right in Russia itself. A historic contract between Poland and Sweden. Russian submarine fleet, beware.
Now the Russian Baltic fleet in Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg finds itself under a total NATO underwater blockade.
NATO is already at Russia's borders. Finland and Britain are preparing to confront Putin.
This is no longer a drill, this is a direct signal to Moscow.
Real hell in Dnipro. The Russians are trying to simply destroy the city's civilians with ballistic missiles. But Ukrainians are not staying silent and are striking back, including in the Caspian and Dagestan. We will show you this unique footage. In addition, we will show you how that infamous Sarmat missile simply exploded right in Russia itself. And we'll also talk about how NATO is getting closer and closer to the borders of the Russian Federation. For example, Finland and the United Kingdom. They are preparing to confront Russia in this region about all the most important events in the military sphere. We will talk about this right now in the report, and then I'll be waiting for you in the studio for a discussion.
The armed forces of Ukraine have regained control of the situation in Huliaipol. More than 20 attacks were repelled in the area of the settlement. There were no new breakthroughs, and the defense forces of southern Ukraine report that all attempts to storm our positions were unsuccessful.
Today, a new defensive line has been established in Huliaipol. The new line of defense will take into account the landscape of this area. This is not an industrial Donbass, unfortunately. However, there are rivers and forest belts here which may allow us to hold on to the positions we currently have.
As it became known after the Russian advance in this direction, the command decided to redeploy part of the reserves to Poduliaipol. At the same time, Russia has already rushed to claim that its troops have entered the district center itself. However, this information is refuted by our Center for Countering Disinformation. The fake news from the Russian-backed republics about the occupation of the village of Vysok has also not been confirmed.
They have indeed come right up to our heavily fortified defensive area and critical logistics center, posing a significant threat. They are trying to send groups, some of them, to the outskirts. Intense fighting is once again taking place in Huliaipol. There, for our defenders, as it were, reinforcements have arrived. No additional resources for reinforcement. And there is a struggle to stabilize the situation in this direction.
At the same time, analysts say that Pokrovsk remains the main focus of the enemy's efforts. Attacks are taking place around the clock, both in the city itself and on its outskirts, in hopes of encircling the Ukrainian group.
The enemy currently controls most of the significant areas of the city of Pokrovsk, including the south and the center. They are trying to carry out such actions and also gradually encircle it, tightening the ring around Mirnorad.
However, in their endless assaults in the Pokrovsk direction, the Russians are suffering colossal losses. Our command does not hide this. The main task of the Ukrainian armed forces today is to inflict maximum damage on the enemy group. And in this, the defense forces are doing an excellent job.
The losses are so great that they have to use reserves that, in theory, were not intended to enter Pokrovsk. And even with operational reserves, Russia cannot take Pokrovsk. Right now, on average, more than 200 bodies are lying per square kilometer of the enemy. That is, killed and wounded. And that is an enormous number.
At the same time, in addition to defending, our soldiers in Pokrovsk sometimes even manage to advance. In particular, as reported from the ground, there are periodic sweeps of the enemy beyond the railway line, which now serves as a kind of dividing line in the city.
The defense forces are indeed succeeding in counterattacks, which are being carried out in particular near Pokrovsk as well. We're talking about Kupiansk, we're talking about almost all our locations where the Russians are trying to advance.
Speaking of Kupiansk, according to Putin himself, the city is surrounded and under Russian control. In reality, there is no encirclement at all, and there are fewer and fewer Russians in the settlement with each passing day.
The enemy, unfortunately, the enemy is still in Kupiansk for now, but it is quite possible that the defense forces will be able to improve their tactical positions. Today, I'm not saying that we will be able to completely drive out the enemy, although the current trend in Kupiansk shows that the defense forces are managing to clear our Ukrainian land of the enemy meter by meter. And
good news also came yesterday from the occupied territories. In particular, details have become known about the strike on Crimea. Thus, the General Staff reported that on the peninsula, the Panzer S-1 and Tor-2M air defense systems were attacked. After that, drones managed to destroy a warehouse of Orion and 4-post drones, as well as strike a command post and a concentration of enemy personnel.
Local Z channels were in a panic, claiming that all sorts of devices were flying in, even Mavics. And Mavics have a range of 10 kilometers. Where were they launched from and by whom? Well, it's clear it wasn't the Ukrainian military. So then who was it and from where? So these are those very same naval drones whose involvement once again was confirmed by Z channels and which were obviously performing a certain function. They acted as mini aircraft carriers delivering Mavics, which then flew in and destroyed the target. Mavics, in this sense, are actually the perfect tool. So if they manage to deliver them to the shore, then from there on, these tools are practically indestructible.
In essence, the defense forces used a new tactic where one large drone delivers several smaller ones to the attack site. A lot of small ones. And considering that everything went successfully, it seems that Russia's rear areas will soon face a lot more problems.
Military analyst Alexander Kovalenko is joining our broadcast. Alexander, hello, we're glad to see you.
Good evening.
So I want to start with the tragedy in Dnipro. At least 4 people have already died, according to confirmed information. The Russians struck with ballistic missiles. Please tell us, what is the target? What are they trying to achieve when they use ballistic missiles on residential neighborhoods? Absolutely. And this was evident in all the videos published today.
Often missiles like the 9M723, which is a ballistic missile, are used. They are used when the Russian command sets out to destroy a target that, in their opinion, is something very important of a certain tactical or operational tactical significance. At the same time, this missile is used also because it is very difficult to intercept. Mainly only systems like Patriot and SMPT are capable of doing that. This missile is expensive, quite expensive, and it is not used simply for basic terror against the civilian population. Other means are used for terrorizing the civilian population, in particular drones such as the Shahed 136 and others. Molnia 2 IPV drones, if we're talking about the border zone, that is, there it's simply a hunt for civilians as a matter of routine. But for the 9M723, there is an unpleasant circumstance. As of today, the production of missiles on the territory of the Russian Federation is completely devoid of technical oversight. That is, if we're talking about the stage of software measurement processes or any kind of checks, for example, design and measurement procedures related to examining the integrity of the body, the operability of the fuel system, the power plant, the guidance system, and many other elements. Such technical control is simply not being carried out now. Often this process takes a lot of time, so they have simply abandoned it in the production of all missiles. The missile is made, assembled, and sent for use. A vivid example is the strike on Ukraine with Kwono-1 missiles that took place last month in November, when 40 Kwono-1 missiles were used. And almost all of these missiles were produced in the fourth quarter of 2025. It's simply impossible to run a missile that was manufactured just 2 weeks ago through all the stages of technical control. Yet another example that this control is simply not being carried out. And all of this affects the quality and accuracy of such missiles. They are fully aware that there will be deviations in accuracy and that there will be civilian casualties. They use these missiles to strike targets they consider important to themselves. Of course, these missiles often veer off by 100 to 150 meters or even more from the intended target. and they hit civilian sites, residential areas, apartment buildings, and so on. But again, this is absolutely no excuse for the Russian occupiers. On the contrary, it only increases their responsibility for committing such crimes, since they are fully aware of what they are sending toward Ukraine. Not precision weapons, but rather means of destruction with enormous deviation. And they are fully aware that civilians will be harmed.
What more is there to add? Let's talk, Alexander, about another case. Defense Express is reporting on some news. It's not exactly breaking news, but nevertheless, it's quite remarkable. There was an explosion at the so-called Yasny Cosmodrome. In the Orenburg region, apparently, a Sarmat missile exploded. By the way, we have video footage of this incident. They write that this could have been yet another test of this nuclear missile, and it ended extremely unsuccessfully. We haven't discussed this with you yet. Could you please explain why something like this could happen to the Russians? And what does this tell you as a military analyst?
This happened for one reason. The Sarmat missile is raw and defective. It is raw and defective. In 2022, it was announced that it had been adopted into service and put into serial production. That sounded ridiculous. It sounded like some kind of stupid joke for one simple reason. As of 2022, this missile had only one conditionally successful test. Why conditionally successful? Because it had a successful launch, it rose to the upper layers of the atmosphere, and then it fell, once again losing the integrity of its body. Before that, this missile had years of unsuccessful throw tests, throw launches. What is a throw launch? It's when a mock-up of the missile is launched in order to study its aerodynamic properties, integrity, and other characteristics. They use a special gunpowder charge to launch it to a height of no more than 50 meters. From 15 to 50 meters, it's simply to study its capabilities. These elementary initial basic tests were postponed for several years due to problems with the integrity of the body and many other elements on the mock-up, not to mention a fully functional missile. That's why, in a rush to threaten the West, to intimidate Western civilization, the Western world, Russia decided to put this missile into service because they had no other. Quite simply, they just don't have a modern new intercontinental ballistic missile. Even their so-called formidable, unparalleled avant-garde blocks are being installed on old Soviet UTTKH missiles, which haven't been produced since 1985. By the way, the avant-garde block was actually created specifically for that missile. Sarmat, the Sarmat missile, was designed for the avant-garde block. It turned out that they created the avant-garde warhead much earlier. It passed testing, but the missile itself is still not ready. The last failed test happened when the missile exploded right in the silo itself. At that time, not only the silo and the test site were destroyed, but also, among other things, there were fatalities and injuries among the testers who were present there. This time, the testers got off a little easier. The missile exploded above their heads right in the launch silo.
Alexander, there's something else I'd like to discuss with you. Shaheds, judging by the footage we're seeing today on Telegram channels, can they now carry missiles? What do you think? Are these images real or are they some kind of fake? I don't quite understand myself how this could even be mechanically arranged. I'll tell our audience that, according to various publications, Shaheds can now launch missiles. For the first time today, Russia used a drone, the very same Shahed type, equipped with a guided air-to-air missile, the R-60. Could you please explain how this could work? It is reported that the Russians want to use this method to shoot down Ukrainian aircraft.
Yes, they will try to do that. This is not a fake. Indeed, a Shahed drone carrying an R-60 missile was destroyed. For civilians, of course, this missile poses a threat, but it has a low-yield warhead, so it does not pose a threat to protected targets. In other words, it is a low-power, short-range air-to-air missile. It is designed to destroy aerial targets at distances of up to 10 kilometers. Unfortunately, in order to destroy a Shahed 136, our powerful helicopters approach, as well as directly aviation's formidable fighter jets and nimble light aircraft, all converging on the target area. supersonic aircraft, jet-powered. They approach to a distance closer than 10 kilometers, even closer. That is, the distance to the Shahed is often less than a kilometer for a helicopter. For direct small arms fire and for a fighter jet, it can be around a kilometer. So all these assets, all these aerial means are operating in a risk zone. Now, since the R-60 is controlled by an operator, when there is no need, for example, to have a radar system or radar complex installed on the Shahed, because the R-60 missile itself is equipped with an infrared homing head, an infrared seeker, which allows it to target aerial objects with a strong heat signature. The fact that this can work is evidenced at the very least by the fact that we used a similar system much earlier on our naval drones.
On our naval drones, we installed air-to-air missiles, such as the R-73 and AIM-9, and these missiles have proven themselves well. Encountering Russian helicopters and fighter jets in the Black Sea, Russian helicopters were destroyed. For example, Mi-8 helicopters were shot down. Thus, with the Su-30 SM fighter, the Russians simply copied it. They just use our experience, but instead of putting it on naval drones, they put it on Shaheds to carry out attacks. Now they are hunting our helicopters and fighter jets. Alexander, your material, as well as many analysts, pointed out that the Russians suffered simply abnormal losses this November 2025. You cite figures showing that 31,190 people were killed in just 1 month, not counting the wounded and captured, which in fact far exceeds the figures for October, and at the very least the monthly figures since April 2024. This is simply a record. Vladimir Zelensky also spoke about this today. Although, in his case, it seems the numbers were a bit more modest, but still, I think he mentioned 25,000 plus what was confirmed by video and photo evidence. So these are essentially confirmed eliminations of Russian occupiers. What is the reason behind such losses among the Russians? And traditionally, can Putin afford to lose so many personnel going forward?
A small correction. We're not talking about a record number for a month of losses. The losses are actually average, quite modest, 31,190. These are rather modest figures. For example, at the end of 24 and the beginning of 25, their losses were 45 and even 48,000. So these aren't record numbers. The record here is something else, specifically 200 killed. That is all those reports presented by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Every day and every month, the losses in personnel are 200, 300, even 400, that is killed, wounded, and captured. But starting from October, there has been an abnormal, truly abnormal imbalance in the ratio of wounded to killed. Usually there are always more wounded than killed. This is normal. It's a common phenomenon in almost all wars. It's a classic phenomenon, I would even say. But at present, the Russians have a complete imbalance. In November alone, they had more than 20,000 irrecoverable losses, killed, not wounded, but specifically killed. That is 65% of the total losses. Similar numbers, about 20,000 killed, were recorded in October. In November, this figure was actually exceeded, and this particular category, this particular moment became a record. And the fact is that never in modern history, in modern wars and conflicts, as well as in the wars and conflicts of the 20th century, has this been observed. Such an imbalance when there are more killed than wounded. I mean, even the ratios used to be different. 1 to 7, 1 to 4, okay, even 1 to 2. But for it to not just be 1 to 1, but actually already 65% of the total, that's something else. What is this caused by? This is due to the fact that Russia is now mainly fighting with infantry. They have minimized the use of armored vehicles. Infantry is less protected. At most, they use light transport vehicles, which again don't provide protection, motorcycles and so on, or it's just wave after wave of infantry. Frankly, we're just talking about cannon fodder. And they overwhelm our positions with sheer numbers. They achieve some of their objectives simply by throwing more manpower at us and launching endless waves. These kinds of assaults, with the hope that somewhere they'll manage to cling to a tree line or to the outskirts of a settlement, maybe get into a basement, a house, a school, or stay hidden in some ruins and then try again. But all of this leads to enormous losses. Sometimes there are even cases recorded where they send such assault groups into attacks. I wouldn't even call them assault groups anymore. It's more like sabotage groups, a large number of them, are sent out almost empty-handed, not even loaded with extra ammunition, standard gear, or plate carriers, that is, bulletproof vests with armor plates. They go out as light as possible with just enough ammo for 1 or 2 closer-range firefights and nothing more. They're as light as possible, completely unprotected. And that's why when they get hit by a drone or step on a mine or come under fire, in most cases they sustain injuries that are incompatible with life. And even if they survive and are wounded, no one evacuates them. They just stay there and die. In other words, they go from being a 300 to a 200. That's why there are such abnormally huge losses in the 200 to 300 category in this proportion.
Alexander understood what the essence of this imbalance is. So here's the question. Deep State writes that despite these enormous losses, including a very large amount of territory, namely, in terms of the number of assaults and occupied territories, the Russians have captured twice as much territory as in September. That is 505 square kilometers of territory, which is 40% of all advances. This happened in the area of Haliaipole. Tell me, please, is this specifically a problem of this direction, or is it systemic? Have they come up with some new tactic, like throwing in even more troops, capturing even more?
I wouldn't say it's some particularly new tactic or that there are any special troops involved. It's just the Russian occupiers who are there. The problem here is with this specific bridgehead in the eastern part of the Zaporizhzhia region. Thank you. In the southeastern part of the Dnipropetrovsk region, and in fact the entire southern Donbas direction. That is starting from Velika Novosilka, which is currently temporarily occupied, and up to the current line of engagement. Regarding Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions, it can be said that this direction is indeed problematic. And the problem is not that the Russians have some kind of new tactic there. The problem is that the issues of constructing proper defensive lines and positions designed specifically to counter infantry, a large amount of infantry components, meaning the predominance of anti-infantry barriers and even their presence, were ignored by the local authorities. This is a question for the regional military administrations, to other territorial communities, to everyone responsible for building the defensive lines. Because the threat that in 2025 Russia would mainly fight with infantry was perfectly well known. The fact that Russian troops, once they approached Velika Novosilka, would continue moving forward towards Mezhretje, Volchia, Varanaya, as well as in the Huliaipol direction from the eastern part of Zaporizhzhia. This was also quite logical. If you just look at the map and draw conclusions about where they will move next, to establish a foothold for further movement towards Zaporizhzhia, they need to reach Pokrovske and Huliaipole. That's exactly what they're doing now. And this has dragged on for a year. This process has dragged on for a year. And during this year, all those areas that could have been turned into an impassable obstacle course for the enemy, this was not done. And now we're discussing how urban combat is beginning, or more precisely, well, not exactly urban combat, but the initial stages of infiltration by a Russian sabotage group in Huliaipol. Well, that's the result. And yes, that's absolutely true. In November, it was precisely the Huliaipol direction that was the most disastrous in terms of the amount of territory captured. More than 200 square kilometers in the Huliaipol direction. From this, I think certain conclusions will also be drawn. At least that's what we hope for.
In conclusion, Alexander, I want to ask you about our successes as well. Dagestan came under attack just for a moment there. All of this is happening under the shadow of the so-called negotiations between Vitkov, our delegations in Florida. Supposedly they were talking about Ireland. In general, something is going on, and I really like that we are not staying silent during this time. According to public sources, the target in Dagestan could have been a defense plant. Please comment on this attack.
Systematic work continues, systematic work across the territory of the Russian Federation, which affects not only their energy sector, oil refining sector, but also enterprises of the military-industrial complex. Systematic work is being carried out in completely different directions. We are now scaling up these strikes across the territory of the Russian Federation, and they are yielding the appropriate results. But the fact that this strike hit Dagestan specifically is a very important aspect. The point is, we're talking about the Caspian, we're talking about the Caspian Sea, we're talking about the Caspian Flotilla. An important aspect is that one way or another, the so-called Russian Black Sea Fleet will at some point have to flee from Russian Novorossiysk. Novorossiysk is already unsafe for the Black Sea Fleet. Running to Abkhazia won't help either. We'll get to them in Abkhazia as well. The Black Sea, that's why for them, the only way out is through inland waterways into the Caspian Sea. And here's what's most interesting. Even in the Caspian Sea, we can reach the Russian Black Sea Fleet if it tries to hide under the wing of the Caspian flotilla. This, I think, is the most interesting point because our drones can already reach the Caspian all the way to Dagestan. And besides drones, something even more interesting and much more powerful could also arrive. Thank you.
Very much. Alexander Kovalenko, military and political analyst, was on the air for Ukraine today. All the best.
Take care.
Every voice matters. Join our community, support independent journalism and help us bring you the truth from Ukraine. Become a member of Ukraine Today. Join us now.